The gown was hanging in the wrong closet on the 43rd floor of the Merritt Tower, and I almost missed it entirely. It was a Thursday evening in late November. I remember because the Thanksgiving weekend had already emptied the building by 4 o'clock, leaving me alone on the penthouse level, with nothing but the Manhattan skyline and 47 fabric swatches I still hadn't finalized. I'd been the lead designer on the Merritt Tower's model units for 18 months, long enough to know that the chandelier in Suite 4302 threw warm amber light at a 7-degree angle when set to full intensity, and cool blue-white when dimmed below 40%. Long enough to know that the difference between those two settings would determine whether the Calacatta marble countertops photographed like art or like a bathroom in a mid-range hotel. Long enough to understand that my job was to make spaces feel like aspirations, like the life someone wanted, packaged in square footage and light. I had not been there long enough to stop noticing that Grayson Merritt's name was on the door of every office above the 38th floor, and that the weight of that name had been rearranging something in my chest since the afternoon I'd first walked into one of his conference rooms, carrying a portfolio I'd spent 3 weeks preparing. That afternoon, I'd been 27 and terrified, fresh from a smaller firm, convinced I was about to be shown the door by some bored executive assistant. Instead, the man himself had walked in, tall, dark-haired, with gray at his temples, and eyes the color of slate on a cold morning, set down his coffee, and spent 40 minutes asking me questions about light temperature and material psychology that nobody in a real estate company had any business knowing. He'd hired my firm on the spot, requested me specifically as lead on every subsequent project. I'd told myself it was professional admiration. I'd gotten very good at telling myself things. The closet I found the gown in was the one built into the northeast corner of the master suite. A pass-through. I'd had custom fitted with mirrored panels so the room would read larger. A crew from Architectural Digest had used the space 3 weeks earlier for a lifestyle shoot, and apparently someone had forgotten to take everything with them. Floor length, champagne satin, with a beaded bodice that caught the overhead light like something out of a different century. A tag from Bergdorf Goodman was still looped through the zipper pull. $4,000 retail, abandoned in a real estate development closet like a forgotten umbrella. I should have left it where it was. I was trying to determine whether the chandelier's warm spectrum reading was accurate against the cream wall panels. I told myself I only needed one more reference point. A light-colored fabric in motion, something with sheen, to see how the angle shifted after sunset. The swatches I'd brought were flat. No movement, no drape. The gown had both. I told myself it was a technical exercise. I carried it to the ensuite bathroom, the one with the full-length mirror I'd specified, antique-finished frame, beveled edge, positioned to reflect both the chandelier and the window view simultaneously. A design choice I was currently regretting for entirely unrelated reasons. The satin slipped over my head and settled against my body like it had been waiting for me. The beaded bodice fit perfectly across my shoulders and pulled in slightly at my waist, in a way that nothing in my actual wardrobe ever did. I stood in front of the mirror in the heels I'd worn for the sidewalk that morning and stared at a version of myself I didn't recognize. Not Ivy Callahan, interior designer, who ate lunch at her desk 4 days out of 5 and owned 3 nearly identical gray blazers, because decision fatigue was real. Not the woman who had spent the last 18 months telling her best friend from college that yes, Grayson Merritt was handsome in the way that certain old buildings were handsome. Structurally impressive, architecturally significant, entirely outside her personal budget. This woman looked like she belonged in that penthouse, not as the person who designed it. I'd been standing there longer than I realized when the elevator chimed. My heart dropped to the floor. Grayson was supposed to be in Boston. He'd had a board meeting that morning and a dinner with the Northeastern Development Partners that wouldn't wrap until 9. I knew his schedule the way I knew the floor plans. Not because I was tracking him, but because I was meticulous about coordinating my site visits around his, maintaining the professional distance we'd both held for 18 months with what I had privately started thinking of as military-grade discipline. The suite's front door opened, Footsteps on the herringbone oak I'd sourced from a salvage yard in Vermont. Hendricks said someone was still on 43. His voice came from the entryway, low and unhurried. I assumed it was one of the electricians. I had approximately 4 seconds to decide whether to call out or to silently cease to exist in the bathroom. "It's me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. "I'm sorry, I'll just be a minute." Silence from the other side of the door. Then, Ivy. Not Miss Callahan. He almost never called me Miss Callahan. He'd started calling me Ivy somewhere around month 3, when we'd argued for 40 minutes about reclaimed wood versus engineered flooring, and I'd told him with great professionalism that he was wrong, and he'd laughed for the first time in front of me. Surprised and genuine, like he'd forgotten he was capable of it. "I'll explain in a second," I said. "Just give me a second." "Take your time." I turned back to the mirror. The chandelier was doing exactly what I'd suspected. The warm spectrum wrapped around the satin's sheen and turned it from simply expensive into something that looked, genuinely, like light had decided to live in the fabric. I had my answer. I also had a problem. Changing back into my work clothes would require acknowledging that I'd put on a stranger's $4,000 gown in my employer's penthouse model unit at 7:30 on a Thursday evening, and I had no version of that explanation that didn't end in profound professional humiliation. I opened the door. Grayson was standing in the hallway between the bedroom and the living area, still in his suit from the Boston meeting. Charcoal, no tie, top button open. He'd come straight from the airport. His leather carry-on sat on the floor by the console table I'd specified in Italian walnut. He saw me and went completely still. Not the polite stillness of a professional encounter. The kind of stillness that happens when something knocks the automatic out of a person and leaves only the real thing underneath. It lasted 4 seconds, 5, long enough that I had time to notice his hands flex at his sides. "I found it in the closet," I said. My voice was doing an admirable impression of someone who was not currently dying, from the Architectural Digest shoot. I was testing the chandelier's warm spectrum reading against a high-sheen surface. It was a technical decision. "Okay," he said. He hadn't looked away. "It's from Bergdorf," I added. "I didn't bring it, obviously." "Ivy," he said my name the way you say a word you've been careful with for a long time. "Does it look good?" The question was so quiet I wasn't sure. For a moment I'd heard it correctly. "The light," I said, "or the. You know what I mean." I did, and that was the problem. "I should change," I said. "Probably." He didn't move, "but I'd like you to stay for a minute, if that's all right." I had worked alongside Grayson Merritt for 18 months. I had watched him dismantle a $40 million deal in a single phone call because the counterparty had lied about environmental permits. I had watched him spend 20 minutes on a Sunday afternoon walking a junior contractor through a bid error rather than firing him. I had watched him, once, from across a conference room, pause mid-sentence and look at me for just a half second, too long before looking back at his notes. And I had told myself with such conviction that I'd imagined it that I'd almost believed it. "Grayson," I said, "I'm your designer and I stopped. Amber is my best friend." Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. Something older and more tired. "I need to tell you something," he said. He walked past me into the living area and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window. Manhattan spread out below us in amber and white. He looked like a man who'd been rehearsing something and had finally run out of reasons to keep rehearsing it. "The arrangement with Amber ended 3 weeks ago," he said. "Mutually. She came to my office and told me she didn't want it. I told her I'd been about to say the same thing." He turned. "I assumed she would have told you." I stared at him. "She didn't tell you," he said. It wasn't a question. No, the word came out flat. She did not. I thought about the last 3 weeks. Amber calling to check in, asking about my projects, asking, specifically, carefully, how things were going with Grayson professionally, whether he seemed distracted, whether anything had changed. She'd been asking me to report on him, while knowing. "Why?" I asked, though I already had a theory forming that I didn't like the shape of. Grayson was quiet for a moment. I think that's a question for Amber, he said. But I'll tell you what I know. When she called it off, she asked me one thing, not to say anything for a month. Said she needed time to handle her end of it. What situation? She didn't say, and I didn't push, because the arrangement was never right for either of us. We both knew it. Our fathers had designed it as a business alliance 10 years ago, and neither of them thought to ask whether their children had opinions. His voice was even and precise, the way it got when something cost him more than he was going to let show. I honored it because I thought I didn't have a better option. The will is specific. I need to be married before I turn 44 in February, or the board votes to open my father's shares to acquisition. My cousin has already had conversations with 2 competitors. I know about the will, I said. Everyone in the company knew about the will. Then you understand why I didn't walk away sooner. He looked at me directly, but I should have, not because of you. I want to be clear about that. I should have walked away because it was wrong to let Amber spend a year in an arrangement she didn't want any more than I did, because we were both too careful to say so. He paused, and because I already knew there was someone else. The room felt very quiet. How long? I asked. Since the day you told me I was wrong about the flooring. A corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. You had 3 data sheets to back it up, and you'd organize them in order of most to least damning. I remember thinking I hadn't been that interested in being wrong since graduate school. I looked down at the champagne satin around my feet. I thought about 18 months of what I'd carefully labeled as professional respect, what it had actually felt like underneath that label. The specific kind of attention that doesn't read as attraction until you catch it at the right angle, the way his schedule had seemed to track mine without either of us acknowledging it. The way he'd once, on a Tuesday evening just like this one, walked past a conference room where I was working late and set a coffee on the table without a word and kept walking. I'd told myself for 18 months that noticing something isn't the same as acting on it. I have to call Amber, I said. I know, he nodded once. I'll be here. I changed back into my work clothes in the bathroom, folded the gown carefully over my arm, and called Amber from the corner of the kitchen I'd fitted with honed black granite and unlacquered brass fixtures. She answered on the second ring. Hey you, she said. Too casual. She always went too casual when she was bracing for something. Why didn't you tell me? I said. A pause, then Grayson's there. This isn't about Grayson. It's about you not telling me for 3 weeks that the arrangement was over. Silence, then a long exhale. Can we do this tomorrow? No, I said. We can do this now. When she spoke again, the casualness was gone. I needed to know if anything was going to happen on its own, between you two, before I put myself in the middle of it. Amber, I'm not the villain here, Ivy. I needed to know whether what I'd suspected for months was actually real before I said anything. Because if I told you and nothing happened, I'd have made everything weird for no reason. And if I told you and something did happen, then you'd always wonder if it only happened because I pushed it. Her voice was careful, deliberate, the way it got when she was being more honest than she was comfortable with. I needed to see if you'd tell me first. Tell you what? I didn't know there was anything to tell. I know. That's actually the part that convinced me. She paused. If you'd known and said nothing, I'd have been angry. But you didn't know because you'd been walking around for 18 months genuinely believing it wasn't real. And that kind of not knowing only happens when something is. I stood there in my gray blazer with a champagne gown, over one arm in a penthouse that wasn't mine, staring at copper pendant lights I'd sourced from a craftsman in Philadelphia, and tried to find the shape of what I was feeling. You should have told me, I said. Yes, she said quietly, I should have, I'm sorry. Were you ever? No, she said before I finished. Not in the way that matters. Our fathers shook hands on a golf course and I said yes because it was easier than saying no to my dad, and then I spent a year figuring out that easier isn't actually easy. She let out a breath. You know what Grayson sent me for my birthday last March? A gift card for a pasta-making class. Which, thoughtful, fine, but he sent it because I'd mentioned offhand in a meeting 6 weeks earlier that I'd always wanted to learn how, and he'd remembered. A pause. That's not a man who's in love with his fiancée, Ivy. That's a man who keeps notes. He keeps notes on everyone, I said quietly. No, Amber said, he really doesn't. I went back to the living room. Grayson was still at the window, his jacket over the arm of the walnut leather sofa I'd selected, looking at the city the way people look at things they've stopped actually seeing. He turned when he heard me. Is she all right? He asked. She's Amber, I said. She'll be fine. He nodded. And you? I set the gown on the console table and stood in the middle of the room I'd spent 8 months designing, the room I'd made to feel like a life someone wanted. And I tried to figure out what I actually wanted. I need you to understand something, I said. I've spent 18 months working very hard to be exactly what this job requires, professional, not someone who makes things complicated. I know, he said. I can't be an arrangement, I said. I can't be the next practical solution after the last practical solution didn't work. I know about the will. I know about February. I know you have 4 months to figure this out, or you lose a significant portion of your family's company. I met his eyes. I need you to tell me honestly where one thing ends and the other begins. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet from me, close enough that I could see he was tired. Not jet lag or a long week, but the tired of someone who'd been holding something at arm's length for a very long time. The will is a problem I had before you, he said. I'll have it after you, whatever you decide. I'm not asking you to solve it. A pause. What I'm asking is whether you'd let me take you to dinner, as myself. Not your employer, not someone with a deadline. His voice dropped slightly. As the man who's been finding reasons to be, on whichever floor you're working on, since about month 4. Month 4, I said. That was the tile dispute. The tile dispute was deliberate. The corner of his mouth moved. I had an opinion about the tile. But I mainly went down there because I'd heard you were likely to have a stronger one, and I wanted to see it. I laughed, surprised out of it, the sound coming before I could think better of it. That is possibly the most Grayson thing I've ever heard, I said. I'll take that as encouraging. I looked at him, really looked, the way I hadn't let myself for 18 months. Still in his work clothes at nearly 8 o'clock, having come straight from the airport to an empty building, standing in the middle of a room full of choices I'd made, asking me to dinner like it was both the simplest thing in the world, and like he understood completely that it wasn't. There will be complications, I said. I work for you. There's a partner-level position opening in the development division in January, he said. It was always going to be yours if you wanted it. You've been functioning at that level for the last 9 months, whether anyone gave you the title or not. Things become less complicated when you're a partner rather than a vendor. You cannot offer me a promotion as a precursor to asking me out. You're right. He was unruffled. The dinner invitation stands regardless, and the position stands regardless. They're independent variables. I'd ask that you evaluate them separately. I pressed my hand briefly over my mouth to keep from smiling. Dinner, I said, yes. Something in his face, not his expression exactly, but something underneath it, shifted, like a room when someone finally opens the curtains. Saturday, he said. I'll make a reservation. Somewhere with decent lighting, I said. Not one of those places that's so dark you can't see what you're eating. Noted. He picked up his jacket from the sofa arm. I'll have the gown returned to Bergdorf. The lighting test was inconclusive, I said. For the record. I think the record would disagree with that. He glanced once at the chandelier, then back at me with the same directness he'd used in every meeting and every job site for 18 months that I'd spent carefully not examining. Inconclusive is not the word I would use. I gathered my fabric swatches, tucked them under my arm, and walked toward the elevator. At the door, I turned back. He was still in the center of the room, watching me go, his hands finally relaxed at his sides. The flooring, I said. I was right. You were right, he agreed. The elevator opened. I stepped in. I don't remember the ride down or the cab home. I remember standing in my midtown apartment with my coat still on, staring at the kitchen wall, thinking about what Amber had said. That's a man who keeps notes, meaning, until I understood she meant me, had always meant me, in the way that things you've been too careful to hope for are sometimes true for longer than you know. I thought about the tile dispute, about the coffee left on the conference room table without a word, about the way he said my name sometimes like it was the end of a sentence he'd been thinking through for a while. I called Amber back. He asked me to dinner, I said. Obviously, she said. Then after a pause, Ivy, are you happy? I looked around my apartment. My drafting board with the Merritt Tower plan still pinned to it. The light coming through the window, warm amber. Exactly the frequency I'd been chasing all evening. Ask me Saturday, I said. But I already knew. The dinner was at a small Italian place in the West Village that Grayson had apparently been going to for 15 years. Not a reservation-required institution, but a family-run room with 12 tables and lighting. I later told him was a solid 8 out of 10. He'd remembered I'd mentioned once, in passing, during a meeting about the lobby's color palette, that the best restaurants smelled like rosemary and old wood. The place smelled exactly like that. We talked for 3 hours. Not about the projects or the February deadline, which I'd half expected to sit between us like an uninvited guest. We talked about the things you talk about when you finally stop being careful. Where we'd grown up, what we'd wanted, before we became what we were, the books that had mattered, the places we'd lived, the specific quiet that comes over a city at certain hours that feels like the whole thing exhaling. He told me his father had built the company the way some men build walls. Solid and impenetrable, no room for anything personal inside. That Grayson had spent 15 years learning to run something that had never once asked him who he was outside of it. The will was his last management directive, he said, and the dryness in his voice didn't quite cover what was underneath. He couldn't let go of the company even from the grave. What are you going to do about February? I asked. He looked at me across the candlelight. Warm spectrum, ideal temperature. Someone in that kitchen knew exactly what they were doing, and his expression was the same one I'd seen in the penthouse. Not performing steadiness, just steady. I'm having dinner with you, he said. That's what I'm doing right now. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have at the moment. He set down his glass. I've spent a long time making decisions based on what the company required. I'd like to spend some time making them based on what I actually want and seeing where it goes. And if the timeline doesn't cooperate, then I'll deal with the consequences. He said it simply, without performance. Some things are worth more than shares, Ivy. The way he said my name. I'd noticed it that first evening on the 43rd floor. I'd noticed it before that. If I was being honest, in meetings, in hallways, on job sites where he'd appeared in a hard hat that somehow still looked intentional. My name in his mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else, like he'd considered it. I'd told myself for 18 months that noticing something isn't the same as acting on it. Standing in front of that mirror in $4,000 of borrowed satin, I'd understood that not acting on something isn't the same as it not being real. We left the restaurant when the family started stacking chairs around us, which is the Italian way of saying it was midnight and they'd like to go home. He walked me out to the street, which felt old-fashioned in a way I didn't mind at all. At the curb, he paused. Saturday was a good idea, I said. I've had a few. He looked at me the way I now understood he'd been looking at me for a long time. I'd like to have more of them with you around if you're open to it. Open to it, I said. That's a very Grayson phrase for asking if someone wants to see you again. I'm working on it. Then quieter, would you? I thought about the version of myself who had stood in that mirror and seen someone she didn't recognize. Someone who looked like she belonged in the life she'd been designing for other people. Yes, I said. He smiled, not the controlled half-smile from meetings, the one that kept the appropriate distance, a real one, the kind that changes a face entirely. I took the cab home with the window cracked and the November air on my face and thought about light. How it falls differently on the same surface depending on the angle, the source, the hour. How the same room can read cold or warm depending entirely on where you're standing when you look at it. I'd been standing in the same rooms as Grayson Merritt for 18 months. I'd just been looking from the wrong angle. The Saturday after that, he met Amber for coffee. His idea, not mine. He said it was important to him that there was nothing unaddressed. Amber texted me afterward with 3 words, "I like him." Then a minute later, "For you, I mean." Then 1 minute after that, "You're welcome, by the way." I didn't dignify that last one with a response. By February, the board had its answer. Not because of a deadline or a directive, but because I said yes and meant it. Not to solve a problem, not to fulfill someone else's arrangement, not out of any kind of obligation dressed up as a choice. I said yes because I had spent 18 months building spaces designed to feel like lives people wanted, and I had finally decided I was allowed to want one for myself. The ring he chose was simple, a round diamond in a plain gold band, nothing architectural about it, nothing designed. He told me he'd had help from a jeweler in the Diamond District who'd asked him one question, "What does she love?" And he'd apparently answered without pausing. "Light," he said, "she loves light." The band caught every frequency. I wore it on a Thursday, back on the 43rd floor, standing in the penthouse suite, where the chandelier threw warm amber across the marble and the whole city glittered beyond the glass. And I thought about a gown in the wrong closet and a question someone had asked me quietly in a hallway. "Does it look good?" I hadn't answered him that night. I hadn't needed to. Some questions answer themselves, if you finally stop being too careful to let them.